Hi there, everybody. So first of all, this is not a podcast about John Adams, the second president of the United States. We're talking about John Adams, the composer of Nixon in China. It's the same John Adams whose opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, is causing so much controversy due to its impending opening in a new production at the Metropolitan Opera this very week. In fact, the very day I wrote the script of this podcast. More about that at another time, hopefully, but you're also looking at the title of this podcast and wondering, what's a minimalist? So I'll tell you. But first, a little bit of music history. In the development of the arts, it often happens that we'll come to a period where things have gotten complicated, encrusted with a tradition or a common practice, and artists will, as a reaction to that encrustation, strip things down or look for simpler and more direct ways to communicate. This famously happened in music during the Renaissance, when the textures of church music, choral music, had gotten so thick and complicated no one could understand the words, the sacred texts, and it took a reformer like Palestrina to come in and change things up a bit. Palestrina's music, elegant, direct, beautiful, and emphasizing the importance of textual clarity, completely refreshed the art form and set a brilliant standard for composers of church music who came after him. But even that became, to some listeners' ears, too complicated, and the response was the relative simplicity of Baroque textures, early opera, and its emphasis on solo singers, the supportive texture of the continuo accompaniment, and the emphasis on word painting. Something similar happened in the 1960s, as a reaction to the fact that classical music, symphonic works, chamber music, opera, had become terribly abstract, academic, and unapproachable for most audiences. In fact, audiences reacted quite negatively to a lot of what they were being presented in the concert hall, complaining especially about a lack of melody or melodic interest. The reaction to this was a new school of composers who sought a kind of simplification of music, a letting go of the intensely academic techniques of composition, the almost mathematical approach to the art. These composers were later labeled minimalists because they emphasized repetition of simple elements like basic chords or melodic ideas, consonants rather than dissonance, slow changes in the music over longer periods of time, music with a very steady and insistent pulse. Names that come to mind are composers like Philip Glass, Terry Riley, Steve Reich, who were centered in downtown New York during the 60s. In fact, they were often referred to as the New York Downtown School of Composers and were considered highly experimental musicians. Now, John Adams was not a member of that particular school of composers. He's actually slightly younger than they are. But he was definitely influenced by those minimalist experiments and began writing music under that influence with his piece for string septet, Shaker Loops, in 1978, while he was teaching at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. But while influenced by minimalism in music, I can't think of John Adams as a strict minimalist like Riley, Reich, or Glass, because he very often goes beyond simple minimal techniques in order to achieve something much more interesting, much more colorful, and much more engaging for audiences, especially in opera. Let me give you a couple of examples from Nixon in China. Now, I know I've used this example before, but Adams' use of an A natural minor scale at the beginning of the opera is a wonderful use of minimalism because that scale is repeated 30 times by the strings of the orchestra. Yes, 30 times. Now, your immediate thought on hearing that described that way might be, oh, how boring. But it's what Adams does around, on top of, underneath, and inside that repetition that makes the passage so interesting. If you listen very carefully, that same scale passage is being played at a slower rate inside the repetition of the scale. Then you occasionally hear a high-pitched sound, played I think by a piano or some other pitched percussion instrument, and then brass instruments playing 4- and 6-note comments or murmurs over that original scale. The effect is hypnotic. And I think it's a wonderful gateway into this fantasy on recent political history. So Adams uses minimalist techniques, but there's so much more to what's going on musically that I would never simply call him a minimalist. Listen to Nixon's first aria, sung after he steps onto the tarmac in Beijing from his presidential play in the spirit of '76. Not only do we have a wonderful, somewhat repetitive accompaniment in the orchestra, the words themselves are treated rhythmically, repeated, played with in order to get new meanings and new inflections out of them. Adams adds the voice to the palette of colors to be used to get an effect, not simply to communicate.
Use, 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 news, 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 as a kind of mystery, as a kind of mystery. When I shook hands with Joe and Lai, when I shook hands with Joe and Lai, on this bare field outside Peking, just now the whole world was listening. The whole world was listening, listening. And though we spoke quietly, and though we spoke quietly, and though we spoke quietly, the eyes and ears of history caught every gesture, caught every gesture, and every word were answered, transforming us as we transfixed the deputy, transforming us as we transfixed the minister, transforming us as we transfixed, made history, as we made history. The eyes and ears of history, as we made history.
The use of the chorus in the opera adds yet another dimension to this minimalist feel of certain passages in the work. For instance, this section of the opening of the work, the opening chorus, "The people are the heroes now." The text is again repeated over and over, but each time it's repeated with slight differences rhythmically, giving the text a sense of freshness and surprise every time we hear it.
Fields
So the answer to the question, is John Adams a minimalist? Well, the answer is no, not strictly speaking. Maybe it's better to classify him as a post-minimalist, a composer influenced by the movement, but who doesn't tie himself to it in any slavish way. Better yet, let's not classify him at all and just call him a damn good opera composer. I'm Nick Reveles, and I'll see you at the opera.